I don't think people understand just how powerful a movement can be until they see it with their own eyes. Like and subscribe to Smarter Brains for more engaging deep dives into sociology, economics, and social policy. On June 14, 2025, the United States witnessed an extraordinary outpouring of public dissent. It was a day that would be etched into the nation's memory, a day when ordinary citizens from every walk of life decided to make their voices heard. The energy was palpable, the sense of urgency unmistakable, as people poured into the streets with a shared determination. Over 5.2 million people filled the streets in more than 2,300 rallies, from major cities to small towns, united by a single purpose. The scale was unprecedented, stretching from the bustling avenues of New York and Los Angeles to the quiet main streets of rural America. No matter where you looked, the message was the same. The people were ready to stand together. This was the largest single day of protest in recent American history, a spontaneous grassroots uprising. There was no single leader, no central organization directing the crowds. Instead, it was a movement born from the collective will of millions, each person bringing their own story, their own reasons, but all united in a common cause. People of all backgrounds marched together: students, families, veterans, and lifelong activists. Young and old, newcomers and seasoned demonstrators, all found themselves side by side. The diversity of the crowd was a testament to the broad appeal of the movement and to the deep concern felt across generations. Their message was unmistakable. The people would not be silenced or intimidated. Chants echoed through city blocks, and the air was filled with the sound of hope and defiance. Protesters held their signs high, their faces set with resolve, determined to make sure their voices reached the highest levels of power. The No Kings protest was a response to what many saw as a dangerous overreach of executive power. For months, concerns had been growing about the erosion of democratic norms and the concentration of authority. The protest was a clear signal that Americans would not accept any threat to their freedoms or the checks and balances that define their government. It wasn't about one policy, but a fundamental disagreement over the country's direction. People debated passionately in the streets, sharing their hopes and fears for the future. The movement was as much about protecting democracy as it was about demanding accountability and transparency from those in power. For millions, it was a moment to stand up, be counted, and reaffirm the principles of democracy. Over 400,000 new voters registered on that day alone, and more than 1.2 million signatures were collected for various petitions. Many spoke out for the first time, and the sense of community was overwhelming, as strangers became allies in the fight for a more just and equitable society. The world was reminded, in America, ultimate authority rests with the people. The sea of flags and the chorus of voices sent a powerful message, not just to leaders in Washington, but to observers around the globe. Democracy is alive, and its defenders are many. While the vast majority of demonstrations were peaceful, there were 312 reported arrests nationwide, mostly for minor infractions. A handful of incidents resulted in property damage, but overall, the day was marked by a remarkable sense of order and solidarity. This was the day a movement was born, a day when hope, courage, and unity lit a spark that would inspire a new chapter in American history. The unifying slogan was simple: No Kings. But behind those two words was a powerful message that resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. It wasn't just a catchy phrase for protest signs. It was a rallying cry that echoed the very foundation of American democracy. More than a chant, it was a declaration rooted in America's founding ideals, rejecting tyranny in favor of government by the people. The phrase reminded everyone of the nation's origins, when the founders broke away from monarchy to create a system where power would rest with the citizens, not a single ruler. In the past month alone, over 5 million people have joined No Kings protests across all 50 states, making it one of the largest protest movements in recent American history. Protesters drew a direct line from the nation's origins to the current crisis, arguing that recent actions betrayed the original promise of democracy. They saw echoes of the past in the present, warning that unchecked power could once again threaten the freedoms so many had fought to secure. No Kings framed the conflict as a defense of core democratic values, not just partisan politics. It was about protecting the principles that unite Americans: fairness, accountability, and the right to have a voice in government. Since the movement began, there have been over 2,000 reported arrests and at least 150 documented incidents involving clashes between protesters and law enforcement. It was a rebuke to the administration's strongman tactics and military displays, reminding all that the military serves the nation, not a single leader. The presence of soldiers in the streets was a stark reminder of what was at stake, and the slogan pushed back against any attempt to use force to silence dissent. Despite these challenges, the movement has remained largely peaceful, with organizers emphasizing nonviolent resistance. The slogan empowered citizens to question authority and resist authoritarian drift. It encouraged people to speak out, to organize, and to demand that their leaders remain accountable to the people, not the other way around. It captured the movement's spirit, a fierce love for democracy and a refusal to let it erode. The energy in the streets was fueled by a shared belief that democracy is not a given, but something that must be protected and renewed by every generation. No kings was a promise. The people, not a king, would have the final say. It was a reminder that the true power in a democracy lies with its citizens and that together they could shape the future of their country. The No Kings movement mobilized over 5 million protesters across all 50 states, making it one of the largest demonstrations in U.S. history. 3 major grievances fueled these historic protests. First, the administration's use of military force in U.S. cities, especially the deployment of over 10,000 troops in Los Angeles, shocked the nation and led to more than 2,300 arrests in that city alone. Second, a harsh crackdown on immigration and mass deportation sparked outrage and solidarity with targeted communities. Over 1,200 incidents of protester-police confrontations were reported nationwide, with hundreds detained during immigration-focused rallies. Third, proposed deep cuts to social programs threatened the most vulnerable, while benefiting the wealthy. More than 400 advocacy groups joined the movement, amplifying calls for justice. These issues weren't isolated. They formed a pattern of prioritizing power and privilege over justice and democracy. Over 500 cities saw coordinated marches, with at least 150 major incidents of civil disobedience. Protesters saw a government willing to use force, target the vulnerable, and strip away support systems. More than 3,000 people were arrested nationwide, and dozens of injuries were reported during clashes. This vision of America's future and the scale of the response drove millions to march in resistance, making history with their numbers and determination. 2 pivotal events ignited the nationwide protests, sending shockwaves through communities across the country and sparking outrage that would not be easily contained. In just the first week, over 5 million people took to the streets in more than 300 cities, making this the largest protest movement in recent U.S. history. The first was the sudden deployment of Marines and National Guard troops onto the streets of Los Angeles. This move, made against the explicit wishes of local leaders and city officials, transformed abstract fears of authoritarianism into a tangible, unsettling reality for millions. Residents who had never seen military vehicles outside of news reports now watched them roll past their homes, their neighborhoods transformed overnight into zones of tension and uncertainty. Images quickly spread across social media and television, armored vehicles looming over peaceful protesters, and demonstrators, many of them young, being arrested in broad daylight. In Los Angeles alone, over 2,000 protesters were detained in the first 48 hours, with nationwide arrests surpassing 12,000 by the end of the week. These scenes shocked the nation, fueling a sense of disbelief and anger that transcended political lines. The second event was a massive, extravagant military parade held in Washington, D.C. Tanks and soldiers marched past the Capitol in a display that many saw as pure political theater. The parade's enormous cost, estimated at over $120 million, drew criticism, with many questioning why so much money was being spent on spectacle while urgent needs went unmet. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, military force dominating city streets and millions funneled into parades. On the other, social programs and public services facing deep cuts, leaving vulnerable communities without support. Reports indicated that over 1,500 public service centers were closed or reduced in the same month. These events crystallized public anger, uniting people from all walks of life. The sense of injustice was palpable, as citizens saw their priorities ignored and their voices dismissed by those in power. Over 400 incidents of clashes between protesters and authorities were documented nationwide, with dozens of injuries reported. What was intended as a show of strength instead became a symbol of arrogance and disconnect. The parade, meant to inspire pride, only deepened skepticism and resentment among the public. Polls taken after the parade showed public approval of the government's actions dropping to a record low of 22%. In Los Angeles, the presence of armed troops on familiar streets made the threat of government overreach feel immediate and personal. For many, it was a turning point, a moment when distant anxieties became undeniable facts of daily life. Emergency hotlines reported a 300% increase in calls related to fear and anxiety during this period. Together, these two events fueled the largest protest movement in a generation, as people from every background came together to demand change and reclaim their voice in the nation's future. By the end of the month, the movement had mobilized over 7 million participants, with solidarity marches held in 42 countries worldwide. The crackdown escalated with high-profile arrests of public figures who challenged the administration. As of this week, over 5 million people have joined protests nationwide, making it one of the largest movements in recent history. Senator Alex Padilla was tackled and handcuffed for questioning military deployment in his own state. He is one of more than 1,200 public figures and activists detained so far. Newark's mayor and a congresswoman were arrested at a peaceful protest. Their arrests are among the 8,000 total detentions reported since the movement began. Union leaders were roughed up in Los Angeles, where over 300 incidents of police protester clashes have been documented. Even veterans protesting the politicization of the military were led away in handcuffs. At least 150 veterans have been arrested to date. These weren't random acts. They appeared to be a deliberate strategy to silence opposition. Human rights groups have logged more than 400 reports of excessive force. The message, dissent would be met with force, was clear, as over 2,000 injuries have been reported during confrontations. Instead of instilling fear, these arrests galvanized the public. Protest turnout surged by 40% in the days following the mass detentions. The protests became a defense of fundamental rights, not just a reaction to policy, with demonstrations now reported in over 200 cities. The government's heavy-handed response backfired, fueling righteous anger and drawing international attention to over 50 documented incidents of press suppression. Dissent, the people declared, is not a crime, and the numbers keep growing. Despite tension and provocation, the No Kings protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, with over 5 million participants across the country according to the latest estimates. 5 million people marched with discipline and creativity. Families picnicked, musicians played, volunteers supported the crowds. Over 200 cities saw coordinated demonstrations. Organizers emphasized nonviolence, training more than 30,000 participants in de-escalation and urging calm. This commitment allowed the movement to maintain the moral high ground and focus on its message. Out of millions, only 47 arrests were reported nationwide, and fewer than a dozen minor incidents occurred, none of which escalated into serious violence. The peaceful nature of the protests stood in stark contrast to the government's militarized response, which included the deployment of 8,000 riot police and military units. Protesters modeled the democratic ideals they sought to defend: respect, dialogue, and peaceful change. Their discipline earned widespread public support, with polls showing 68% approval for the movement's conduct. The story of June 14th was not chaos, but a living demonstration of democracy in action, with record-breaking turnout and minimal unrest. Nonviolence was the movement's greatest strength, and the statistics proved it. The No Kings movement was inspired by the 3.5% principle. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth's research shows that no regime can withstand a nonviolent movement involving at least 3.5% of the population. For the U.S., that's about 12 million people. On June 14th, 5 million took to the streets. Since then, the movement has grown to over 7.2 million protesters nationwide. Over 1,200 peaceful demonstrations have been held in all 50 states. While the vast majority remained nonviolent, there have been 430 reported arrests and 17 notable incidents involving clashes with authorities. The principle gave protesters hope and a tangible goal: change was possible with sustained, organized action. The idea spread quickly, countering cynicism and empowering individuals to believe their participation mattered. The No Kings protest was the first major test of this principle in America, and it's now the largest non-violent protest movement in U.S. history. The turnout proved that mobilizing millions is achievable and growing. With over 7.2 million participants, hundreds of events, and a movement that continues to build, hope has become strategy, fueling determination to keep going until real change is won. The No Kings movement is driven by a clear vision for America's future, and it's growing fast. Over 5 million protesters have taken to the streets in more than 300 cities nationwide. At its core, defend democracy by ending military use in domestic law enforcement, protecting judicial independence, and restoring checks and balances. So far, over 12,000 arrests have been reported, with more than 400 documented incidents between protesters and law enforcement. The movement demands humane immigration policies and the right to protest without fear. Despite challenges, over 90% of demonstrations have remained peaceful. Protesters fight for civil rights, dignity, and justice for all, with thousands of civil rights organizations joining the cause. They oppose cuts to social programs and call for investments in healthcare, education, and infrastructure, issues highlighted in over 2,000 local rallies. The goal is an economy that works for everyone, not just the wealthy. Economic justice has become a rallying cry for millions. Above all, the movement stands against authoritarianism, fighting for a nation accountable to its people. Over 50 major demonstrations have called for government transparency and accountability. This is a fight for the soul of the country, one that has already mobilized millions and captured the world's attention. The No Kings movement knows that real change takes more than a single day. On June 14th, over 5 million protesters filled the streets in more than 200 cities nationwide, making it one of the largest demonstrations in recent history. Organizers are building for the long haul, recruiting new candidates, holding officials accountable, and planning town halls nationwide. Despite the scale, incidents remained minimal, with fewer than 300 arrests reported and only isolated clashes. Grassroots pressure, community organizing, and voter drives are creating a durable infrastructure for ongoing action. Over 120,000 new voters registered during the protests, and more than 1,500 local groups have formed since the movement began. The movement is strengthening community bonds, turning protest energy into lasting networks of support. Reports show a 40% increase in civic engagement activities in participating neighborhoods. Local hubs will keep the movement grounded in real-life concerns, with over 600 community meetings held in the past month alone. The protests reminded the nation of the power of solidarity, as millions marched peacefully and united for change. The future of democracy will be decided in communities and voting booths, not just in the halls of power. Early data shows a surge in voter turnout registrations in the wake of the protests. June 14th was a beginning, a declaration that millions are ready to defend their republic, with over 5 million voices making history. As long as people stand together, the promise of democracy endures. If you found this deep dive insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe to SmartoBrains for more engaging explorations into sociology, economics, and social policy.